In this PowerPoint, we're going to be talking about measuring national income with gross national product, GNP, looking at overall growth, and the GDP, or gross domestic product deflator, which helps us account for inflation and track inflation. And there will also be a series of testers on GDP and related material for you to be able to test your knowledge. First of all, you're going to hear in economics gross and net. There's several different circumstances which you'll hear this from. If you've ever held a job, you may find that when you get your pay slip, there might be there will be the overall total of what you've earned. We call that gross wages. And then there could be various deductions for taxes and so on. And what you end up with afterwards is known as the net. And you can see that the net is less than the gross, because the gross is before any deductions, the net is after. But we also use the term gross and net when looking at the value of assets. So let's say you're a business and you've bought a machine for the year for $5,000. The amount overall that you've spent on the machine is $5,000, and we call that the gross. But after a year, if we were to look at the value of the machine, it would no longer be worth $5,000 because of wear and tear, or what we call depreciation. So let's say if the depreciation was $500 worth, then the net value would be the initial $5,000 minus the $500 for wear and tear, or replacement, and the net would be $4,500. So that's another context for gross and net. Gross national product. You need to know this quite well. We're looking at gross national product, GNP, versus GDP. GNP is defined as, and you may be asked to define this in an IB exam or test, it's defined as GDP for the overall country. So in other words, all of the goods and services produced within the geographical boundaries within a time frame, typically a year. And then we're going to add net property from abroad. And the term net means that we're first going to look at all income that we earn from abroad, add that to GDP, and then we're going to subtract any income sent abroad. So looking at, and there's a small brief video that's been posted as well on Blackboard for you to be able to follow the link to see that. If you had, let's say within Canada, you were looking at GNP. So we would look at the GDP of everything that's produced within Canada. Then we would take any multinationals which are operating in Canada and subtract any income that they've sent abroad, so any of the profits and so on that they've sent to their home country. But we would also add to the equation any income that we have of Canadian companies that have been operating abroad when we bring our income back home. So GNP is a better sense of sort of the overall income or wealth of a country. So gross national product, GNP. So we would look at, here's the gross national product here. We would take into account, we would look at the gross domestic product. We would add, so if this is in the case the US, we would add any income from the rest of the world, so US income from the rest of the world. So we would have that here, less any money leaving the US to pay multinationals, and our net would be this. So in other words, to get to the GNP, we would take GDP and add the net income from net income. And we get the net income by looking at the income that's coming into, in this case, the states, and subtracting any income leaving the states, depending on ownership. We're going to be asked, or you are going to be asked, to calculate GDP growth rates. Now, before I get into the GDP growth rates, first of all, GDP you might see represented in a table or in a chart where it's GDP figures overall from year to year. But more often than not, you're going to see in charts the growth rate. So has it increased by 2%, decreased by 0.5%, and so on, and then that would be mapped out. So we also need to be able to calculate the GDP growth rates. So again, think of that odd sounding animal, the new. So we take new minus old, and we divide by old. But since we're looking at rates, we always multiply by 100. So here's the formula here. New minus old over old times 100. So in a country, GDP was 50 billion and increased to 51 billion. So the new would be the 51 billion. We would subtract the 50 billion, the old. We would divide by the old, which is the 50 billion, and multiply by 100. So we would be left with 1 billion over 50 billion times 100, and cross out the billions, and we would be left with a growth rate, of 2%. And don't forget to include the percentage, don't just call it 2. So economic growth. We can think of economic growth in the model that we've seen already, the production possibility frontier, as a PPF shifting outwards. And when does the PPF shift outwards? When we have an increase and or improvement in the factors of production, so the cell, capital, entrepreneurship, land and labor, and when we have an improvement in technology. So looking at a GDP deflator. Now this is really a higher level topic, but if you were standard level, it's not a bad idea to just listen to this one slide, so you're a little bit more versed in how inflation and so on are tracked. In terms of memorizing a formula, I would memorize this formula here, where the GDP deflator, which is equals nominal GDP over real GDP times 100. And we're going to talk about nominal and real in just a moment. If you were asked, because sometimes you are on an IB paper 3 question, to calculate real GDP, well, you can get this formula by rearranging this one. So unless you're really, really comfortable with memorizing, I'm not, the less I have to memorize, the better. If you've memorized this one, then you can simply rearrange it to come up with this one. And a homework assignment has been given for that. So the GDP deflator is going to give you a sense of how much inflation there's been, and where you particularly tend to use it if you're looking for the real GDP and you're given the GDP deflator figures to take inflation into account. So let's look at this table. We need a base year, and in the base year, the index, or the deflator, is always 100. There's going to be inflation if the GDP deflator is over 100, and there'll be deflation if it's less than 100. Now, nominal means simply in this year's prices. So if the base year is 2000, we're going to take the price of 20, and you'll see that nominal is going to equal real in the base year because we're using $20 for both calculations. We're going to take price times output, and so nominal GDP would be $2,000. The real GDP would use the base year price. Base year happens to be the same year, which is 20. Multiply it by output, and you would come up again with $2,000. For the following year, when we calculate the nominal GDP, we're going to take the current year prices. So that we've noticed that the prices have gone up. So we'll take that current year price, multiply by the output, and we come up with $2,200. For the real GDP, we're going to take again the base year price. We're not going to use the prices with inflation. We're going to back inflation out of it. We'll take 20, multiply by 100 again, and we come up with $2,000. Now, how can we interpret the data from this? Most data is given in real terms because it doesn't muddy the situation by including inflation. So when we see that the real GDP in 2000 was $2,000 and the real GDP in 2001 was $2,000, we know for sure that output remained constant. This is important because then that will also help to determine unemployment and employment and many other factors, but we know that output remained the same. If we focus on nominal GDP, which uses the current year prices, and nominal GDP went from 2,000 to 2,200, we don't know if we are producing more, if that's all the data we have. We don't know if there's been inflation, or we don't know if it's been a combination of inflation and increasing output. So nominal GDP is not nearly as helpful as real GDP. So for the balance of this PowerPoint, our testers, for you to test your knowledge of the last few PowerPoints that you've seen, and also a desk copy has been posted on Blackboard so you can compare your answers to that. Thank you.